How are you guys doing today? More Kant. More Kant. Yay. This Kant it's the same Kant. He's a systematic thinker too. I think one of the real tricks to really getting a grip on Kant is recognizing that it's all kind of the same project, although it's totally possible to treat this project that he's up to in the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals to just treat it separately from the sort of thing that we saw in the Prolegomena and the first critique. It's much closer. In fact, he mentions that this is the next step in this inquiry that he's working out here in the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It's not just a moral theory. It's a metaphysics of morals, and it's not just a metaphysics of morals. It's a groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. You get some sense of just how far back Kant is reaching to do this work. The companion piece from this is, in fact, the second critique, the critique of pure practical reason. Third critique is, or what's usually referred to as the third critique, is the critique of judgment. And that first critique is the critique of pure reason. Maybe more to kind of situate this in the second half of the class, rather than situating, we could do this. We could situate the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals against the Prolegomena, which we read. And there are going to be maybe some moments here today in what we go through that we might kind of point, especially when we're talking about the function of reason, that it would help to be able to go back and remember what it was that Kant had to say about reason back in the Prolegomena and in the first critique. But again, it's not necessary. Maybe a smarter or more effective way of situating this project is situating it within the arc of the political philosophy that's going on throughout the early modern era, starting with Hobbes and then Locke and then Rousseau. And Kant is taking some really big cues from Rousseau. There's going to be at least one moment today where I'm going to kind of point back and say, remember Rousseau said something almost identical to this. And Kant read Rousseau, and Kant definitely identifies that Rousseau had a big influence on him, that he's bringing a lot of these ideas from Rousseau. Kant was a big Rousseau fan. Although whereas Rousseau was French and kind of spoke in very poetic sorts of generalities, we'll get the German treatment of those ideas from Kant, and it's going to be very detail-oriented, as we're kind of accustomed to seeing. Another thing that's maybe worth pointing out, and that I'll definitely say this a couple of times throughout today's session. Remember when Rousseau said in The Social Contract that all of these ideas hang together, I just can't say them all at once? And there's definitely some flavor to this. And there's some of this flavor in Rousseau's approach to The Social Contract. That there's what makes it compelling, if anything makes it compelling, is this incredible coherence of everything that he's saying. And it's not necessarily kind of going step by step in the fashion of an argument. First we believe this premise, then that premise leads us to this next premise, then that leads us to this next step, then that leads us to this next step, and eventually we get to the conclusion that I want to draw. No. Instead he's painting a picture, and understanding this picture means you kind of understand how all the various parts hang together, and maybe necessarily have to hang together. There's no way out of this. Some folks will accuse this of being a circular sort of reasoning, but there have been a couple of moments throughout this semester where we've identified that not all circular reasoning is necessarily viciously circular. This might be a kind of a virtuous circularity as well. And with Kant in particular, we'll see he starts with some fairly plausible ideas. And then almost everything that we're going to do today is just kind of elaborating on one idea over and over and over and over again. Maybe the idea is going to be what it means to have a moral law. Maybe the idea is going to mean what it means to have a good will. And Kant is going to show that these two things are tied up with one another inextricably, and almost everything else that he's going to say is going to just be an elaboration on what the moral law is, what the idea means, what the concept of the moral law is, what the concept of a good will is. We're going to get some what seem like necessary, at least as far as Kant is concerned, some necessary features of what a grounded moral theory is going to look like as a result of that. So situating this within the political philosophy, we might kind of recognize, too, that this is not a political work, this is a moral work. The two are not completely distinct from one another, though, right? If there are, if we were going to say that political philosophy and moral philosophy are not exactly the same thing, at the very least they're close cousins. And we get really, really close to this. There was not a whole lot of consideration of morality so much when we were looking at Hobbes or Locke, but with Rousseau, this was an idea that came rushing into Rousseau's political philosophy. The idea of Rousseau's general will, the idea of like a proper functioning civil state for Rousseau is one where we become moral people. And as a matter of fact, a big part of Rousseau trying to sell the idea of going from the state of nature into the civil state is the gaining of moral liberty, the ability to become a moral person outside of civil society. Without that, it's kind of difficult to see how one could become a moral person. So this is the extension of that conversation. We've kind of like brought morality into the conversation, and now we're going to take a deep dive into like, so what is morality? And we're going to get a version of morality that's going to be capable of sustaining what's pretty much the idea that most of us are operating with, I would say, even today, of what universal rights look like. Universal human rights. So this is while not explicitly political in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, what hangs in the balance is whether or not we can articulate the concept of a universal human right, an absolute human right. So here's as good a place to start this conversation as any. Slavery, bad, right? If you had to take a position on slavery, it'd be like frowny face, thumbs down. Always bad? Are there perhaps some versions of slavery that are like, yeah, but maybe that one could be good? What about a form of slavery where, I don't know, a very small number of people were enslaved, but a much larger number of people were benefited greatly from that slavery? Is that one okay? Because in conversations that I've had with not just students, with all kinds of people, conversations that I had with my family this weekend about morality, an awful lot of people, near as I can tell today, are operating most of the time on an idea of morality that is consequentialist, that is, basically utilitarian, that says, here's how you determine what the right thing to do is. The right thing to do is whatever yields the most beneficial consequences, or whatever avoids the most harmful consequences. Is that about right? If I gave you like a scenario, classic trolley problem scenario, and I was just kind of like, here's the tracks, and then the tracks split, and like if you don't do anything, the train is going to go and it's going to kill these 5 people, but if you throw the switch, the train will get diverted, and it's only going to kill 1 person, and these 5 people will live. What should you do? Should you throw the switch? Nah. Jack says, nah. Just for yucks, nah? Or like for really real, yeah, nah. See, that's not what I would say is like a super like morally respectable response. It's like, I don't really care anyway, and like probably everything's going to turn out okay. Like the way that we usually kind of rig this thought experiment, by the way, is that like it will definitely kill the 5 people. You're not going to get bailed out at the end. An angel's not going to swoop down from heaven and like pick the train up and everybody lives. Like no, it's like the consequences of this action are in your hands, whether the switch gets thrown or not. And most people in this kind of scenario would say, if you can save 5 lives for the price of 1, this is better than saving 1 life for the price of 5. Because it's about maximizing beneficial consequences. And this is so deeply ingrained in our thinking that it becomes sometimes very difficult to understand what somebody like Kant is talking about, because he is not doing that at all. What we're looking for here are absolute moral laws. Moral laws with no exceptions. Certainly not exceptions that say like, well, you can break that moral law so long as more people benefit. Or so if we were to say something like, is slavery wrong? It seems like a utilitarian would be kind of shackled to this idea that like they can't say no absolutely. Is lying wrong? Is stealing wrong? Is murdering people wrong? And anybody who says what we're trying to do, the difference between right and wrong is whatever maximizes beneficial consequences, it seems like they're going to have to say, like, I can't completely rule out the prospect of a moral form of slavery. If there was greater benefit than there was harm in this particular form of slavery, or if this was a way to maximize benefit, then we would have to say that this is not only an allowable form of slavery, perhaps this is maybe an obligatory form of slavery to instantiate. So how is it that we can get certain sorts of like absolute moral laws? We might even wonder, like, do we even want them? Some folks might be skeptical of the prospect of absolute moral laws. Those of you with maybe more religious sensibilities might say, like, well, there's at least 10, right? There are at least 10 absolute moral laws, like thou shalt not whatever, right?
You said with no exceptions, right?
Yeah, like thou shalt not steal. Doesn't come with like an asterisk on the stone tablets that says, like on the back it says, unless utility could be maximized by stealing, in which case like you got to do it, right? Like no, these are what's that?
I said as far as like morality, like the word absolute, I say it has to be this way and not other. I don't think it can possibly work.
Don't think it could possibly work?
I mean, possibly.
So you should not, are you saying absolutely you should not operate according to absolute rules? That's a trap. That's a trap. And don't take it. Might there be some absolute moral rules? It might be this question of like, it might just be hard to like find those absolute moral rules. We also might find that like when we have candidates for these absolute moral rules and we're looking at it, we might say like, some of those absolute moral rules, I don't want to follow them in certain situations because like it feels bad or it seems wrong to me. But why do we trust our intuition on this? Why would I say like, so thou shalt not lie? Let's try that. That's actually, if we have time, we're going to get around to saying like, thou shalt not lie. Like ever. How is this going to work? It's going to be something that falls right out of Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. And sometimes folks will be like, yeah, but like never? Like surely there are some situations under which it's at least permissible to lie. As a matter of fact, here we go. Like in the Hackett version of Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, we'll see that there's a little essay, because Hackett is all about value here. There's a little essay that comes along for the right at the end called On a Supposed Right to Lie from Philanthropic Concerns. And guess what Kant's take on this supposed right to lie from philanthropic concerns is? He says, well, it's just a supposed right. It's not actually there. Like if lying is wrong, it's like completely wrong. That's what it would mean to say, like, lying is wrong. So even if we imagine some scenario where it's kind of like it's Holland 1945 and the Gestapo knocks on your door and they say, like, hey, do you have Anne Frank and her whole family in your attic? And you totally do. Kant would say, like, still, can't lie. It can't be a moral action, at least, to lie. And we'll get some sense of this, too, as like, all of this unfolds. So you might be skeptical about it. It might not sit well with you. But keep in mind, Kant is going to say, if we're talking about absolute moral laws, and we might get a sense, like, pretty early on, like, why we might have to have at least some absolute moral laws. It doesn't really matter how you feel about them. You don't have to like your duty. You don't have to like your moral duty. You don't have to like the moral law. You just have to recognize it and obey it. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why we don't just let people go around doing whatever seems right to them. We say, like, no. Like, that's not a very reliable source of morality. So that's one of the things that is going to hang in the balance. And if you like the idea of universal rights, such that, like, anytime they're violated, something bad has happened. For example, like a right to liberty. That's grounded in a moral obligation to respect people's liberty. Not just in a kind of like, this is the only way we hypothesize to get out of the state of nature and into civil society, but something that's grounded in a moral obligation, in a moral duty, then there's at least one part of you that is, I would say, passingly interested in the prospect of absolute moral laws. You would want that one at least. Here's another, before we kind of get started, like going step by step through the groundwork, here's another scenario that I'll just kind of float and ask what your intuitions on this are. Let's say I'm walking down the street, not down the street because that's dangerous. Let's say I'm walking down the sidewalk next to the street. Walking down the sidewalk, I'm like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then as I'm walking, there's a little crack in the sidewalk, but I don't see it because I'm like thinking about Kant. And I like trip over it, and as I trip and I go kind of stumbling forward, my hands go out to steady myself. And then, okay, now let's cut that story and rewind to like about 30 seconds before. Up above the sidewalk, on like the 4th floor of the building that I'm walking next to, a small baby is like gone up next to a big window and is looking out the window, and the small baby like pushes on the window and the window opens. And the small baby then kind of like starts climbing up on the windowsill, and nobody's watching, and the small baby like goes crawling out the window and starts tumbling. All right, now cut back to me, who's like stumbled, and this is where we left me, right? The baby comes falling out of the sky, hits me like right in the crook of my elbow, and I don't even, to say that I caught the baby is maybe even giving me too much credit. My arms just kind of automatically fold up over the baby. And everybody standing around just like looks at me and is like, he's a hero! Am I a hero? Did I do anything good? Did I do anything morally praiseworthy, morally respectable? Now the consequences turned out nice. The baby got saved, I suppose. I didn't do anything.
What happened is you just tripped.
Huh.
Which, I mean, like, isn't you doing anything, it's just kind of something happened.
It just happened to me, right? We would say, like, you didn't save the baby on purpose. Like, maybe we can say you saved the baby, and that's, like, debatable, too. I don't know if you saved the baby. The baby got saved by landing on you. But I didn't do anything on purpose. Here's another version of the same sort of thing, but instead of, like, something supposedly maybe praiseworthy, we're like, nah, I don't know. Let's try this the other way around. Let's try something like, I'll kind of, instead of just an accident, let's make it that I was trying to do something that was actually pretty bad. Let's say I'm a mad scientist, and I devise a weather machine, and I'm going to use this weather machine to control the weather, and then I'm going to extort people all over the world and say, like, give me money, or I'll bring tornadoes to your door. And if they don't give me the money, then I'm gonna mess their shit up big time. And if they do give me the money, then I'll take the money, and I'll leave them alone. And this is what my plan is. But because not because I'm like a bad, mad scientist, but because, like, being a mad scientist ain't easy. And, like, weather machines are not, like, the most straightforward things in the world to invent. It turns out that the machine that I make just makes the weather beautiful all the time, everywhere. Like, I push the button and it like and starts like malfunctioning, and then smoke comes up and lights are flashing and sparks and fire, and then we look out the window and like suddenly every place, everywhere, at all times has beautiful weather. And I know some of you might be thinking like, don't you sometimes have to have like rain, otherwise the plants won't grow? Like, yeah, but like it's gonna rain, but it's always gonna be like the best kind of rain. You've had this rain, right? Where you're just kind of like, it's rain, but it's not like bringing me down. Like, this is like, the plants needed it. And it's like sunny while it rains, and you're just like, you go outside and you're like, oh, it's wonderful. This is the rain that happens. There's never a blizzard that like kills a bunch of old people. There's never a drought. There's never any of this stuff. Every place always gets exactly the weather that it needs at that time. I'm a hero, right? No. For the same reason as before, though, right? Maybe even a stronger intuition here. I was trying to do something bad. I was trying to harm people. I was trying to exploit people for my own personal gain. And only accidentally did I do this good thing. The thing that, like, maybe the takeaway from this is that when we're talking about, like, moral value, when we're talking about whether or not, like, there's morally praiseworthy content to somebody's actions, motives matter. And notice this about motives. They're very, very different from consequences. Consequences come after an action. Motives come before. This is like probably the easiest way to make a distinction between consequences and motives. The consequences come after, and motives come before an action. So Kant is looking to, if we just kind of like want to situate this in like what might be desirable in this project, we'll know that like he's interested in the prospect of absolute moral laws, and I'll even kind of, folks like Benjamin might be saying like I'm skeptical of the prospect of like the possibility of an absolute moral law. But can we at least agree with this? If there were genuine absolute moral laws, it would be nice to know about them. We would really want to know about them. By the time we get through the preface in chapter 1, I don't know if you guys noticed this, Kant has never once made a claim that there are any universal absolute moral laws. He's just said that there's an idea of them, and he's just kind of unpacking what that idea is. It's not going to be until, and we might get it at the if we have time, which is not looking good so far, because I'm just like blah, 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 babies and weather machines. If we have some time, I'll give us one that, like, maybe this is an absolute moral law. Like, don't lie. Don't ever lie. But what about Anne Frank? Like, no, still, don't lie. Which isn't to say give up Anne Frank and her family, but maybe, like, you just shut the door on the Gestapo. And you're like, do you have Anne Frank? And you're like, like that. That probably won't work as well. But maybe invite them in and say, like, I'm not going to answer your question, but I have questions of my own. What led you to this place in your life? What kinds of decisions brought you to the point where you're, like, hunting Anne Frank and her family? What did they ever do to you? Yeah. Well, Inglourious Bastards aren't going to be the sorts of moral heroes that Kant is going to hold up either. All right. The preface of the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals begins in, I think, a pretty interesting way where Kant kind of like zooms out and he says, here's like all of philosophy, and like something we're going to zoom into like the metaphysics of morals. We're going to understand like what place this has in relation to all the other forms of philosophy, including the one that we saw in Kant's Prolegomena. So there are three major, as far as Kant is concerned, there are three major domains of philosophical inquiry. What are they? This was a quiz question. Yeah, logic, natural science, and ethics. Three domains, three philosophical domains of inquiry. Logic, natural science, and ethics. We'll get to logic in just a second, but like here's the big difference between natural science and ethics. Natural science describes how the world is. What does happen is how Kant says it. Natural science describes what does happen. If we're doing certain kinds of natural science, we might talk about what did happen in the past. But that's just a past tense version of what does happen. We might make predictions about what will happen in the future, but that's just a future tense version of what does happen. And this is very, very different than ethics, which he says is a science of freedom and involves questions that include questions about what should happen, what lies outside of natural law. There perhaps is an assumption that's being operated upon here that human freedom is the sort of thing that makes this a distinct sort of investigation from this. There are natural regularities that you can kind of you can plot the paths of all the celestial bodies because none of them ever decide to like wander, right? When we decided Pluto wasn't a planet anymore, it's not like Pluto's going to be like, I'm angry, and like stops going around the sun. Like, no, Pluto does exactly whatever Pluto's going to do. Doesn't care what we say about it. Doesn't care about anything. Doesn't have any cares. There is no freedom with respect to like the paths of planets through the solar system, right? Through anywhere. But when we're talking about agents, when we're talking about things like humans, if there is freedom, if there are decisions that can be made, if we're not going to kind of like completely capitulate to determinism, then it seems like some kind of different sort of science is going to be required. At the very least, we're going to need to be able to talk about what ought to be the case. And sadly, what ought to be the case and what is the case are not exactly the same thing. Fair enough? We all in agreement about this? Some of you might be thinking to yourselves like, yeah, but like determinism is true. Nobody actually does make any real choices for themselves. Everything, like every choice that you think you're going to make, like you want to do something like completely random, like nobody ever knew I was going to do that. Like, no, that was also predetermined. Like, you've done it before in exactly this point in this lecture, and like we can look back on YouTube and see like all the times that Adam's done exactly that move, and say like, yeah, it's totally predetermined. Because you had to make a point, and like, what was the best way to make the point? Do something silly, wake up the people who were sleeping. Like, I'm just responding to like causes, and my behavior is just an effect. This is maybe something that you might think, and there are all kinds of really interesting discussions to be had about this. But for the time being, at least, can we recognize that if all of your choices, they're not really choices, right? If everything that you do, if all of your actions are determined and not in your control, then all this conversation about morality is just like a complete waste of time. You can't talk about like how things should be if there is no option except for like how they're going to be. At the very least, maybe the thoughts that you're thinking are within your control. So for the sake of having a conversation about morality, which you're going to have because I'm the teacher and I said so, or maybe of your own free will you want to choose to have a conversation about morality, we're going to have to entertain some notion of something like freedom. All right. So we got logic, we got natural science, and we got ethics. Natural science is about what is the case, what does happen. Ethics is about it's about dealing with this this weird little curveball that freedom throws into the mix, where it's not quite as predictable, and the sorts of things that we want to talk about are what should happen. We might even look around at like what people do. I'm going to say duty, and I just said do. Funny things to say, I guess. We can look around at what people do, but that's not quite the same as what they ought to do, right? We can make even generalizations from how people do act. We might even make generalizations about, like, these are the only ways to have a functioning society where people don't kill one another. But we haven't yet said whether that's desirable, right? We haven't yet said, like, well, should we prefer a functioning society where people don't kill one another? There's got to be some kind of grounding somewhere in that. All right, so natural science, and here's where we start to get like some additional divisions. Logic is always pure, as far as Kant is concerned, and I think he's got a point to make here. Logic is always pure, and what do we mean by pure? Think back to the prolegomena. Pure means free of very good. Free of empirical content. So completely a priori as well, right? Completely free of empirical content. You don't need any sense data in order to do logic. You just need to be able to think. And logic is always pure. There is no empirical dimension to logic, says Kant. Natural science has a pure component, and it also has an empirical component. The empirical component of natural science is pretty much what gets called science today. And if we wanted like one discipline to kind of like sum it all up, we could call it physics. Now that's not necessarily physics in the sense of what goes on in the physics department. This is physics in the sense of the study of nature and how nature does work. The laws that we can divine by looking at how it is that the natural world behaves. The orderliness that reason can kind of impose upon it. The stuff that we saw in the prolegomena. How is natural science possible? Well, we're talking about like an empirical natural science there. The pure version of natural science, the pure version that has no empirical content whatsoever, that looks at the natural world and how it works, is called, not physics, but metaphysics. Kant specifies here that this is a metaphysics of nature, but we can just call it metaphysics because it's pretty much like what most people mean when they talk about metaphysics. We got physics and then we got metaphysics. And this is what the study of the natural world looks like when we divorce it from any kind of empirical content. Just thinking about like what are the things that have to be the case in order for us to even be able to do physics in the first place. This we saw in the prolegomena. These questions about like physics and metaphysics and even like mathematics and logic and stuff like that, the pure content that has to do with logic. What we're going to get here in ethics is a pure version and an empirical version as well. The pure version, well, let's start with the empirical. Yeah, let's start with the pure version. The pure version is like metaphysics, but it's not about the natural world. It's a metaphysics of morals. Hey, that's the title of this piece. And what does he call the empirical dimension?
Practical.
Yeah, practical anthropology. You think about this, it's just looking at people and what they do. And you might even be able to kind of like figure out some generalities from the empirical study of how people do act, about like when people act like this is what happens. When you slap somebody in the face, they get angry and slap you back. They tend to, right? This is a science of freedom, so they won't do it every single time. It's not perfectly predictable like the heavenly bodies. But there's perhaps good reason to expect it. And we might even be able to say something like from here, like, if you don't want to get slapped back in the face, then don't slap somebody in the face in the first place. Which sounds almost kind of like we're in territory that we saw with our social contract theorists. We're in territory that also sounds maybe strikingly like the golden rule. Don't treat people badly if you don't want to get treated badly by them. You could get that from practical anthropology. And if you've heard some stuff about Kant before and you were thinking to yourself, like, what Kant is going to say is like pretty much just the golden rule. Corbin and I were having this conversation in my office earlier, meaning that like Kant's categorical imperative is pretty much the golden rule. Kant's categorical imperative is a very specific interpretation of the golden rule that is very, very different than if you don't want people to treat you badly, then don't treat them badly. In fact, Kant's categorical imperative doesn't have an if in it at all. That's why it's categorical and not hypothetical. We'll get to that at our next meeting. All right. This is what we're after. And why? Why are we after that? Kant says we have at least these two motives. Why should anybody spend time on a metaphysics of morals? Kant himself doesn't take up the metaphysics of morals right away. He starts in on this stuff. Groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is in 1785. 4 whole years after he did the first critique. 2 whole years after the Prolegomena. Kant himself says this was a far more pressing endeavor. But once I finished it, I was ready to tackle this one. But why should we care at all about it? And Kant says, look, there are at least these 2 motivations. There's a theoretical motive, and there's a practical motive. And the theoretical motive is all about grounding moral principles. This is what is at the end of the why chain? If I say something like, you shouldn't slap people in the face, and you say why, and I say, because then they'll slap you back, and you're like, well, why do I want them to not slap me back? And I'm like, well, will that make you sad? And you'd be like, yeah, I guess so. And like, well, you don't want to be sad, do you? And you're like, well, why should I not want to be sad? Like, you could just keep why chaining this maybe forever, and Kant says, like, no. This is going to bottom out. This has got to bottom out someplace. If it doesn't bottom out someplace, then a metaphysics of morals is just not possible. But again, we're not making any claims about whether it is possible. We're just talking about what it would look like. We might stumble upon. This is kind of how like the Prolegomena work too. It's like not committing to anything just yet. We're saying this is what it would look like if metaphysics were possible. And then by the time he's explained it all, he's like, and we've been doing it all along. Similar sort of thing. You just have to kind of buy into the notion that, like, if it were possible, it would be interesting. And so for that reason alone, we should maybe want to check out whether it is possible. I meet lots of people that have very strong opinions about, like, whether or not morality is, that coming up with absolute moral principles or grounding morality is the sort of thing that's possible. I haven't met too many of them who actually spent a whole lot of time on it before coming to the conclusion that it's not. They, like, tried for 5 minutes and were like, nope, couldn't come up with anything. Like, must not be possible. Well, why? Like, why is it not possible? Is it because people disagree sometimes? Why should that mean that it's just not possible? It just means that, like, some people disagree about it. People disagreeing about stuff doesn't mean there's no truth to the matter. People disagree about all kinds of shit. People disagree about whether or not the earth is round. Today. The mere fact of disagreement means nothing at all about whether or not grounding moral principles is possible, whether or not there are such a thing as like absolute moral laws that everybody ought to follow, whether they know about them or not, whether they want to or not. The practical motive, if you buy into the idea of morality in the first place, and I kind of suggest you should, but if you don't buy into it, then like me saying that you should probably won't move you at all. You'll be like, should, schmould, like who cares? The practical motive has to do with kind of protecting or insulating us from all of the things that might corrupt morals. You might start off like trying to be a good person, but there are all sorts of things that might corrupt you. If you can't ground your moral principles, if they're just kind of like floating up in the air with like nothing holding them down, then you can be subject to all kinds of like little corrupting influences that'll like, I don't know about you guys, like sometimes I failed to do the right thing, and it was just because like something came in and like distracted me. Something shiny got in my way of thinking about how I ought to act. And I was like, oh, I want the shiny, and then like I went after the shiny, and then afterwards I was like, I should not have gone after the shiny. Not like that, at least. So we want to get away from these corrupting influences. And some of those corrupting influences are going to be things like desire, inclination, the sorts of things that like make you want to go after shiny things, the kind of things that make you want to go away from scary things. At least as often as I've been kind of distracted from my moral duty by things that I wanted, I've been distracted from my moral duty by things I did not want, by things that I was trying to avoid. Why did you steal from that person? Because I was hungry and I didn't want to starve to death. Why did you lie? Because I was afraid people wouldn't like me if they heard the truth. Fear and desire are these things that can kind of distract us. These are perhaps corrupting influences. And if I can't have something that grounds my moral principles, if I can't say, like, even when you don't feel like it, this is kind of like maybe what this comes down to. I was hammering this really, really hard in environmental ethics yesterday. Morality can't just be, and like, hopefully this is not the sort of thing that's going to be like too terribly controversial. Morality can't just be doing whatever the hell you feel like doing. Is that fair enough? Like if there's such a thing as like how you ought to act, it can't be like, just do whatever you want. And you might think to yourself, like, well, I'm always going to want to do good things. Like, maybe, probably not. But you know that there are going to be some people who feel like doing terrible things. They may feel like murdering you. Or worse. So it can't just be doing whatever you feel like doing. Something's got to ground that. Something's got to be like the sort of thing that you can reach for and say, like, even when I don't feel like it, perhaps even when it doesn't seem to me like a desirable thing, like a thing worth doing, I still need to do it. The word that we might be looking for here, and this is like why the Kantian approach to ethics is sometimes called a deontological approach. This comes from the Greek word deontos, and I guess the Greek word logos. But deontos is the Greek word for duty. And duty is the kind of thing that, like, you should do regardless of whether you feel like it or not, right? If I say, like, here's your duty. If you're a soldier and your duty is to, like, hold the line, and you're like, but I'm scared and I don't feel like it. I want to run away. Like, that doesn't change whether or not this is your, like, it's still your duty. You can fail to fulfill your duty. That's a possible thing. I'm not saying that there's any metaphysical necessity that duty brings with it, such that, like, you can't avoid doing your duty. It's just that if you do fail to do your duty, you haven't done your duty. You haven't done what you were supposed to do.
And therefore you are being poor in ethics in this case.
I would suppose so. If it was a moral duty, right?
Yeah.
Now you might have a moral duty that conflicts with like your like political duties. You might have a political duty to apply the law evenly, but you might look at the law and say something like, that's a terrible law. So you might have a moral duty that conflicts with the political duty, but if we're talking about a moral duties like tell you what it is that you ought to do. And if you fail to abide by your moral duty, then yes, you have not done what you ought to do. Nothing flashy there, too. That's like true by definition, right? The duty determines like how it is that you ought to act. Failing to do your duty is failing to act the way that you should. Charles.
Could you like frame it as your duty is always preferable for you to have your duty?
More than preferable. Because here's the thing about duties. They're not just like good ideas. They're the sorts of things that if you don't do them, you have done something wrong. Duties are obligations. There are lots of things that are preferable, but we might say that like you don't necessarily have a duty to do it. Like something that comes to mind here would be I don't know if I have an obligation to give all of my money away to famine relief. It might be preferable for me to do this. It might maximize beneficial consequences for me to do this. But I don't know if I would say that I have a duty to do this. And the reason why I think that that might be the case is because if I don't do it, I don't think I've done anything wrong. Does that seem fair enough? So this is like duty is it's carries more weight than mere preferability. Now maybe there isn't maybe there isn't this middle ground between like things that would be nice, things that would be preferable for you to do, but they're not your duty. We might say it's always your duty to do like the most preferable thing.
Greater overall duty versus
Yeah.
connotation duty.
That might be one way to parse it, right? Yeah. But at the very least, on its surface, it looks like duty and preference are not exactly matching up. They're close cousins. They're in the same neighborhood. They're playing the same sport. They're just
to make sure I'm getting it, we're assuming the idea of like an idea of good and evil that goes beyond practicality.
Oh yeah. This is not about. Oh yeah. So like, thanks for making that segue. This is not about practicality, right? Mostly because like practicality belongs to this domain. And there are a variety of other things that like are in my notes that like we could be saying here, but like I wanna kind of move along. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of throw a cluster of concepts. I've already got a cluster of concepts up here, but let's start with pure will. These are kind of musts. A pure will. He ends the preface with a little conversation about what a pure will is. He then begins chapter 1 with a conversation. Sentence 1 of chapter 1 is about what a good will is. And a pure will, by the way, what's a pure will? Let's start with the pure part. What does the pure part mean?
A priori.
A priori, no empirical content, right? So the pure part is like no empirical content. And the will part is, where is it? Motives matter? The will part is the motive. The will is what motivates me to act, right? So whenever I act, if I'm acting from a pure will, I am acting in such a way that like there's no empirical content to what motivates me. Fair enough? Everyone's like, I don't know, I'll write it down in my notebook, I guess. What about a good will? What does he have to say about a good will? How does chapter 1 start? So I said sentence 1, chapter 1. Got it, Corbin?
I had a question about pure will.
All right. While people are looking for the first sentence of chapter 1, let's field this question about pure will. Yep.
Could you have a pure will if you don't have any sense experience?
Can you have a pure will if you don't have any sense experience? Well, you have to have some sense experience to get the whole measure. Remember back in the Prolegomena, like, what was it? Intuitions without concept? No, concepts without. I've forgotten it.
Without intuition.
Concepts without content? Is that what it was? Concepts without content are empty? I guess anything without content is empty. Yeah. But the gist of it was concepts without like empirical intuition, like feeding it. Remember, empirical sensation is like that's the fuel that thinking requires in order to get going at all. This is why Kant is not necessarily a rationalist, or if he is, he's a rationalist in a really weird way. You got it, Pearson?
Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without content.
Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind, right? So like something needs to feed it. So, but maybe we're gonna say something like, that's not what's being taken into consideration in the motivation. That would be what a pure will is like. A good will. Who's got this quote? Sentence 1, chapter 1.
Nothing in the world or how it could possibly conceive that it could be called good without qualification except a goodwill.
Goodwill is the only thing that is good without qualification. And he goes on to kind of talk about like there are all kinds of things that are good, but they're good with qualification. So like money, is money good? I guess like sometimes it depends, right? Depends on what you spend it on. Is talent good? Not in an unqualified way. The ability to successfully navigate the world and get what you want, is that good? Again, not in an unqualified way, right? It depends on like what direction you point those talents in, or that skill, right?
Talk about a person's character.
Even character, yeah. If we're thinking about this in terms of like kind of bits of like total virtue that I can kind of separate off, like honesty. Is honesty good? Perhaps not in an unqualified way. Perhaps it depends on what I do with that. Yeah. Is courage? Maybe that's a better one than honesty. Is courage good? Depends on what I do with that, right?
And only to a certain point.
Yeah, that we might say if it's like beyond that certain point, then it's not really courage anymore. It's recklessness now. The only thing that's good without any qualification is a good will. Is being motivated to do what's good. To say, like, I will what is good. I want to do the right thing. I stumbled there just a moment, and like maybe Corbin caught it. Yeah, but like what's motivating me is like a desire. Yeah, we'll see. Because the trick here that like we're going to run into is that will is not the same thing as want. Because wanting something is a desire, it's an inclination, it's passion, which is something with empirical content to it, right? You can't have a pure goodwill if willing is just wanting something. Perhaps there's no such thing as a pure will if willing is the same thing as wanting. We saw John Locke maybe kind of blur the line between willing and wanting, but Immanuel Kant is going to cleave these two things in twain, and he wasn't even the first on the scene. We saw this with Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well. Rousseau said, doing whatever you feel like. This is what natural liberty was. Natural liberty was doing whatever you feel like. And Rousseau says that is not what moral liberty is. Moral liberty is not just doing whatever you feel like. That's what wanting is all about, right? It's like doing what you want to do. To will is something slightly different. That's the sort of thing that moral liberty consists in, having a will. Having a will, that's the thing that steps in. You ever want to do something but not?
Yeah.
Cake? Sex? Cigarettes? Lots of things that I see. Sometimes I can't stop myself and I just go right after what I want. Sometimes something's scary and I just run away. That's the wanting part. How do you stand up to those desires? You exercise your will. It takes willpower to not just do what you want. Aha! We couldn't have like a clearer depiction of how these things are not the same thing. Will is what stops you from just doing whatever it is that you want. And some folks might say like, but that's just maybe a higher order desire. Like I want to be thin. I want the cake, but I also want to like be thinner. And so because I want to be thinner more than I want the cake, I manage to like not do the cake. But Kant says like, no, something different is going on here. And what's going on here is that we have an exercise of reason. That this is, if we're going to talk about a pure will, if we're going to talk about a good will, if it's going to be different than just doing whatever inclination leads you to, than just like some version of like organizing desire. If there's going to be some sort of ground to not just what I want, but what I should want to do, then reason's going to have to step in. It's going to have to be this thing that's dispassionate. The moral content of a good will is the sort of thing that is not motivated by interest. He says goodwill, if a good will is going to be like a good will, if you're going to have a pure good will, we're talking about motivation, and it has to be motivation that works in the right sort of way. Not directed toward the right sorts of objects, because as we know about like a good will, like when I talk about somebody having a good will, I don't care if they actually succeed in doing the thing that they were trying to do. This is maybe one of the things that makes it super plausible when Kant says the only good thing that is good without qualification in this world or even out of it is a good will. And we know this because when somebody tries to do something good and they fail, it doesn't diminish their attempt to have like tried to do the good thing in the first place. And this is completely different than if somebody like tries to do something and they succeed, but it wasn't a good thing. Like anything that was praiseworthy about success does get diminished by the fact that it wasn't success in achieving something that was good. So a good will doesn't necessarily concern itself with like the successful achievement of its goal. It's about what motivates the attempt to achieve the goal. It's about what motivates action, and whether or not that action is going to be motivated in the right way. And Kant says it needs to be motivated by reason. Otherwise, it's not going to be a free sort of will. And if it's not a free sort of will, it has no moral content. Did I move too fast? Was that clear? If it's not going to be motivated by reason, if it's going to be motivated by desire, well, just doing whatever desire tells you to is not being free. That's being a slave to desire. The only way that you're going to be able to be free, to be able to rule yourself, is to be able to rule your own desires according to reason. And we can't have morality without freedom. No freedom, there's not like what ought to be, there's just what happens. So if we're going to have morality, we got to have freedom. If we're going to have freedom, then the will has to be governed by reason. Reason has to be what motivates our choices, if those choices are going to have any moral content to them. This is where Kant gets into a conversation about the difference between, it's time for a different color, into a conversation about the difference between acting from duty versus merely acting in accordance with duty. Did you follow this passage when he started talking about this? It's kind of actually a remarkably lucid moment in an otherwise kind of a confusing little cluster of concepts. This idea of like the will and a good will and reason are all kind of like hanging together in this way that we see that like the only way that I am going to get a good will, the only way that I'm going to get actions that are motivated in this sort of way, they would have any sort of moral value whatsoever to them. They would be the sort of things that's like actually praiseworthy, is if they're motivated in the right way, if they're aimed towards the good simply because it's good, doing the right thing for no other reason than because it's right. That this is what it means to act from duty, to act from duty, as opposed to merely acting in accordance with duty. Kant trots out like 4 different scenarios. The first one is like one that is like, well, clearly that's not doing the right thing. It's like when you just fail to act in accordance with duty. You just didn't do the right thing. Like, all right, well, if you didn't act in accordance with duty, then like we're not going to be able to say that you did the right thing. You might have had a good will, but you didn't succeed, so your action wasn't good. You might act in such a way that's in accordance with your duty, but you did it because you were coerced by some sort of external agent. Somebody bribed you to do your duty, or somebody threatened you with some sort of harmful consequence if you don't do your duty. So like because you were afraid of that consequence, you did the thing. Is that morally praiseworthy? If you have to be bribed or threatened into doing what's right, did you actually do what's right? The consequences might have turned out okay, but you didn't do it, right? You're not responsible for your action. And you certainly aren't responsible in a way that's praiseworthy. This cannot have possibly have been motivated by a good will if you have to be threatened or coerced in some way to do what's right. And then Kant says, like, okay, so that one's not as plausible. Like, you acted in accordance with duty, but that wasn't acting from duty. Well, how about this option? It's not an external coercion. It's according to your own inclination. Like, I wanted to do my duty. Wanted to do my duty. And I wanted to do my duty because, like, it's going to give me a warm fuzzy to do it. Not because of some external praise or blame, but because, like, that's how my inclination leaned. I found it desirable to do my duty. Now, this is one where, like, I think Kant maybe loses some folks. He definitely loses Aristotle. By extension, maybe me as well. Kant says this cannot possibly be acting from duty. This is acting from inclination. Again, willing is not wanting. That last move is, as far as Kant is concerned, is not really all that different than the external coercion. It's internal coercion, right? I'm not responsible, and I guess what this comes down to is I'm not particularly responsible for my desires. Like, I'm responsible for my actions, perhaps, but maybe not my desires. Does that seem fair?
Yeah.
Like, there's the chocolate cake. Should I eat the cake? No, you shouldn't eat the cake, Adam. Okay, but I want the cake. Should you want the cake? Like, I don't, like, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but, like, that doesn't really help me because I can't stop myself from wanting the cake. And this is maybe where, like, virtue theorists are going to be like, you can change your desires. and fears. You can shape your character in this way, but it takes a lot of work. Like, I certainly can't do it in the moment, right? It's too wishy-washy. Action that comes from desire, action that comes from inclination. If what I'm looking for is an absolute moral law, if what I'm looking for, by the way, I can't believe I didn't get this word on the board somewhere in here, universal. If I'm acting according to inclination, there's no way that this can be a universal moral law. A moral law that applies to all people equally, that applies at all times, that doesn't like disappear tomorrow. Again, like commandments perhaps, like thou shalt not lie. If that's a commandment, if that's like a legit absolute moral law, it's true today, it's true tomorrow, it's true next week, it's true for me, it's true for you, it's true for everybody. It has this universality. The same way that reason, by the way, has a certain universality. It's not just that reason gets us away from being like led around by the nose. It's not just that reason is the way that like my will can be free, the only way that I can be in control of myself by following what reason dictates instead of what desire dictates. But reason is also the only way that I'm going to get any kind of universal moral law. Because my desires and your desires, very well, very different, right? Some people like to be spanked in the bedroom. Not me. That's cool. They can do that if they want. Some people like ice cream with all kinds of crazy shit in it, like caramel and sprinkles and gummy bears. Like, not for me. But that's okay. Like, they can want that. Like, people's desires are different. But reason is the same for everybody. Just like mathematics is the same for everybody, right? You don't get like we don't get to say like, hey, if P, then Q. I did this one yesterday. Let's do. Oh, but Alexander left, so I can do it again. So if P, then Q, and P, therefore, question mark, like what comes next? If somebody was like, well, in my logic, according to my reason, it's not Q. I actually had a student say that to me once. She was like, it makes more sense to me to like say not Q after this, and I was like, how have you not been hit by a bus already? It's got to be Q, right? And if somebody disagrees with this, they don't have their own reason. They're just not listening to reason, right? They're unreasonable. So reason is how I'm going to get to universality. Reason is how I'm going to be sure that like my action is the sort of thing that could be expected not just from me, but from anybody. If I'm acting merely in accordance with duty, but like what's motivating me is desire or inclination or what I want, then there's no guarantee that other people are going to want the same thing. So there's no guarantee that they're going to do what I did. There's no guarantee that my wants are going to stay the same from moment to moment. Even like within one person, over time, your desires change. And so if this is going to be a universal moral law, not just in the sense that it applies to like everybody the same way, but it applies to me at all times, then it's going to have to be acting from duty. It's going to have to be this thing that, like, if I had to sum it up in like one big kind of articulation of like what we mean when we say acting from a good will or acting from duty or acting out of respect for the moral law, which is how we're going to see it in just a second here, is in order for a moral action to have, let's get rid of the moral. In order for an action to have moral worth, it needs to be done for no reason other than it's right. There can't be any other motive for doing what's right other than because it was the right thing to do. If it was because I was going to get rewarded for doing it, then that's not the right kind of motivation. If it's because I was going to get punished for if I didn't do it, that's not the right kind of motivation. If it's because it was what I felt like doing, that is not the right kind of motivation. And by the way, like if this can't be operating at least on some level for us, then it just seems like morality is just not going to be possible. If we can't all agree that, like, here's the real reason for why you should do what's right, because it's the right thing to do. We're wondering, like, where does this get grounded? Where does the why chain end? Eventually we're going to get back to this question of, like, so this is how you ought to act. And somebody might ask, like, yeah, but why should I do what I ought to do? And that's when I say, like, because ought and should mean the same thing. Like, why should you do what you should do? That's just what it means to, like, why should I do what's... Sometimes I'll have students who will say, like, why should I do what's morally right? That's what it means to be morally right. There is no other justification for this. If you need somebody to explain to you why you should do what you should do, then maybe you're not the kind of person that can, like, be a moral agent. This is rationally necessary to recognize that, like, you should do something just because it's the right thing to do. Any other motivation is not going to be acting from a good will. You might achieve the right sorts of consequences, but it won't be motivated in the right sort of way. So it's not going to really have any moral content. It's going to be Adam tripping through the world, like, saving babies, making the weather nice, but none of it was motivated from reason or from, like, a goodwill or any desire to do what's right. And therefore it won't have any moral value. I'm not going to write these on the board because they take a little while to write, and because you've got them in your text, you know where to find them. There was a quiz question about this. Kant articulates, at this point he's kind of done a whole lot of setup. And do you see what I was saying before when I said, like, this is really not, like, a whole bunch of different ideas. Every single one of these things on the board is just, like, a slightly different articulation of the same idea. This whole idea that, like, your actions need to be motivated by reason, that's the same thing as saying your actions need to be done from duty, like acting from duty as opposed to, like, merely acting in accordance with duty. When we say that, like, you have to have a good will, when we say that you have to have a pure will, the only way to have a good will is for that will to be pure and to be motivated by reason, and it needs to be, like, oriented towards doing what's right because it's right. And I don't see how reason can come to any other conclusion besides that. We're going to talk about, like, what a grounded metaphysics of morals looks like. This is the ground of all morality. This is what it means to say that, like, we're going to have if there was going to be a universal moral law, it would have to be the sort of thing that would be the same for everybody at all times. It would have to be motivated the right sort of way. This is the only way that we can get this. It's all just slightly different profiles of the same idea. And here we'll get 3 more profiles of the same idea. This is what Kant refers to as these propositions of morality, right? Number 1, for an action to have moral worth, it must be done from duty. Any disagreements there? Any need for clarification there? Have we sufficiently got to the point, like, where we understand what this means now? For an action to have moral worth, it must be done from duty. Number 2, an action done from duty doesn't get its moral worth from the purpose to be achieved, but from the maxim it involves. Here's a new idea, maxim. Maxim is just a fancy word for a rule. So this is how reason works, right? If we remember back to the prolegomena, reason, one of the things that reason does is it applies universal rules to particular cases. So if I'm going to have a will that, like, is motivated the right way, which is to say that's motivated through the application of reason, it's not going to be about, like, trying to achieve consequences. It's going to be about being motivated in the right way, being motivated in a rational way. It's going to be being motivated from the right kinds of rules, maxims, if you want to use that term. That's proposition number 2. Proposition number 3, to have a duty is to act a certain way out of respect for the law. It's just another way of, like, articulating the same thing. Kant himself says this third proposition is just a logical consequence of the first 2. And if we understand how all of those things just seem to kind of naturally flow from this conversation that's come before, which I'll grant you is a complicated and strange conversation, but also is maybe just a conversation about one idea, which is this idea of like what it means to have a good will. Or, you want to say it differently, what it means to act according, not just according to duty, but to act from a sense of duty. Or, we want to look at it a different way, how to act in accordance with universal absolute moral laws. Or what it means for there to be a universal absolute moral law. This is like the very concept of universal absolute moral law itself. And just to check in with Benjamin here, like I have not at any point said that any of this is possible yet. I've just said that if it were possible, this is what it would look like. And this is what gets us to this articulation, which is eventually in Chapter 2 going to be known as the first formulation of the categorical imperative. And that is, act always such that the maxim of your action could be willed as universal law. Let's highlight a couple of things here just to make sure that like we can see, because my sense is like, have you heard this before? Some of you have had like some kind of encounters with Kant or Kantian ethics or deontological ethics. You might have heard this phrase before. I'm not sure if like everybody who gets exposed to this knows what it means right off the bat. And I'm also not sure that unless you've like worked through the groundwork, I'm not sure that like 9 times out of 10 when I see somebody talk about Kant's categorical imperative, I'm just like, that's not it. That's not the categorical imperative. And some folks might say, act always in such a way such that by following a rule, if everybody did that rule, like you would want things to turn out that way. Like for example, we got what, about 5 minutes here? Lying. Should you be allowed to lie? Thou shalt not lie. That's a commandment. It's thou shalt not bear false witness. But let's not be too precious over the terminology. It means don't lie. What if everybody lied? Maybe this is the test that we're suggesting. If you're wondering whether or not you should be allowed to lie, ask yourself, what if everybody lied? And some folks might look at that and say, like, well, if everybody lied, then there would be like confusion, and like people wouldn't be able to cooperate, and that would be a real bummer, and I wouldn't like that. Nope. I mean, well, yeah, probably. Yeah, that's probably true, but no, that is not what Kant is talking about here, right? Because that's getting at like what your desire would be, and what the consequences would be like. If everybody lied, there would be these consequences, and those consequences would be undesirable consequences. Like, no, he's not talking about that. This is not about consequences. This is about the maxim and the proper motives, and whether or not those motives could be reasonable. Notice that it's willed as universal law. Not that you would want it to be universal law. Act in such a way such that you could will the maxim of your action as universal law, which is to say, act in such a way that you're motivated by a rule, a universal rule. This is the maxim of your action as universal law. Act in a way so that you're motivated by a universal rule that applies in all cases that you could will to be universal. So what would that look like? So don't lie. Thou shalt not lie. What if lying was permissible? Not just permissible, and let's not do this thing like everybody lies all the time. That's just opposite day. Like you can figure that out pretty quick, right? If everybody lies all the time, you're like, whatever anybody says, you're like, okay, so like not that. But like sometimes they lie and sometimes they don't lie. They lie whenever they feel like it. Or as Bart Simpson says to Lisa in, I don't even remember which episode, like, it's okay, I only lied because it was the easiest way to get what I wanted. This is like most lies, right? What if people just lied when there was no other easy way for them to get what they wanted? Can't take this route to like, that would bring about undesirable consequences. I gotta figure this out some other way. Let's start here. Let's do the same sort of like tactics that like Kant likes to use, which is like, let's start with like, what do words mean? What does it mean to lie? False information? But I can give you false information without lying, right?
Not tell the truth.
It means to know the truth and not tell it.
Yeah, because it would have to be on purpose, right? Because sometimes I can just be wrong. And people are like, oh, you lied. And I'd be like, settle down there. I didn't lie. I was just mistaken. So I have to do it on purpose. I have to tell you something that's not true on purpose. And even then, I don't know if that's all, all of those things are lies. Because maybe I'll tell you a story about a magical princess who lived in a candy cane castle. And none of that shit's true. And I know it's not true, but I'm telling it to you anyway. Am I lying?
I know you're not really.
I think it's you're lying. But I don't know if that really counts as a lie. Why might not that be a lie?
This is sarcastic.
You're not presenting as the truth.
I'm not presenting it as the truth, yeah. So this is what a lie is. A lie is me telling you something that I know is false, but I'm presenting it to you as if it were true. If we wanted to make this a little bit more streamlined, we could say a lie is an intentional attempt to deceive somebody. Deception is lies at the heart of what a lie is. Are we all in agreement that that's what a lie is? A lie is an intentional attempt to deceive you by telling you something that I know is false and trying to get you to think it's true. Okay. What if everybody could lie whenever they wanted? Is it possible? Well, first of all, let's start here. Does anybody have any reason to believe anything that anybody says anymore?
No.
If when people are talking, they could be telling the truth, they could be telling a lie, they could mean what they say, they could mean the opposite of what they say. If that's what's allowed, then there's no reason to believe what anybody says. If there is no reason for anybody to believe what anybody else says, is it even possible to deceive anybody? The whole thing that makes deception and even a plausible thing to try to do is that there's this kind of understood rule that when people say something, they mean it earnestly. We know that they can lie, but we also know that most of the time people say what they mean. And this is why a liar is trying to get away with being an exception to a rule that everybody else has to follow. If that rule went away, and everybody's allowed to lie whenever they want to, it's not only that it turns into undesirable consequences. We have this bizarre state of affairs where we're saying if everybody can lie, then nobody can lie. And that, my friends, is a naked contradiction, is it not? If everybody can lie, then nobody can lie? Can you will permission to lie as a universal moral law? Not to say can you want it to happen? Is it desirable? It is not coherent. It is not a reasonable thing to will as a universal moral law because it undermines itself. This doesn't just work for lying. This works actually for a whole bunch of stuff. So we say if everybody can do it, it's not that it becomes undesirable. If everybody can do it, then nobody can do it. Contradiction. You cannot will this as universal moral law. This is what it means to say a moral action that's going to be an absolute universal moral law is something that has to be motivated by reason, and that's why this is the first formulation of the categorical imperative. It's an articulation of all of this stuff that came before. It's basically, Kant doesn't make it up. It just kind of falls right. He picks up the concept of universal law, and he says, maybe these things are possible, maybe they're not, but here's what it means, and he shakes the concept, and this thing just falls right out of it. It's all that it means. All of the rest of the stuff that he said, which is actually just one thing, repeated over and over and over and over again. You guys are crazy patient with the bell having tolled there. How you feeling about this? Weird? Exotic? Cool? I don't know about you. The first time I read and kind of partially understood this, I was I've never thought those thoughts before in my entire life. That's a brand new way of thinking. And that's Kant in a nutshell, right? Every time you see him, you're this guy must have landed from outer space. I don't know any humans who think this way. But it makes sense when you understand what he's talking about. We'll continue this on Thursday with chapter 2 and chapter 3.